You awaken to the sound of stones scraping against stone, the rhythmic grinding echoing through limestone corridors that have silenced human voices for over 3,000 years. Your hands rest on cold sandstone as you rise, and suddenly you realize where you are. Deep within a pharaoh's tomb in the Valley of the Kings, surrounded by hieroglyphs that seem to writhe under the flickering light of your torch. The air tastes of myrrh and something else, something organic and ancient that churns your stomach. As your eyes adjust, you see them clearly carved scenes covering every surface, depicting acts so intimate and strange that archaeologists spent decades debating whether to photograph them. These are not the sanitized images of Egyptian intimacy you learned about in school. These walls tell stories that would make modern audiences blush. Stories of sacred prostitution, ritual deflowering, and sexual practices so intertwined with religious beliefs that they shaped an empire for over 2,000 years. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider giving a like and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to tell me where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Walk deeper into that tomb with me now, because what you're about to discover will forever change how you think about one of history's most fascinating civilizations. In 1323 BC, Anna Cinnamon, aged 14, trembled in the antechamber of the Temple of Kerak. Her linen dress, so fine it could scarcely be called clothing, left little to the imagination. The gold jewelry adorning her neck, wrists, and ankles jingled softly as she shivered, not from cold, but from knowing what awaited her. As the daughter of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten and widow of the young king Tutankhamun, she was about to participate in one of ancient Egypt's most sacred and disturbing rituals, the divine marriage ceremony of the Opet festival. The high priest A emerged from the shadows, his shaved head gleaming with sacred oils, his eyes reflecting a hunger that had nothing to do with spiritual devotion. In moments, Ankhenaten would be forced to consummate a marriage with the god Amun-Ra himself, or rather with a priest acting as his earthly vessel. This was not metaphorical. It was not symbolic. It was Egypt's most powerful religious leaders using divine mandate to claim the bodies of real women. And this happened with terrifying regularity throughout pharaonic history. Papyrus records from Deir el-Medina, discovered by archaeologist Bernard Bruyère in 1922, reveal that this sacred prostitution was not limited to royal women. Temple records show that hundreds of young women served as wives of the god, euphemistic title for what amounted to ritualized sexual slavery. These girls, some as young as 12, were chosen for their beauty and purity, then dedicated to various gods throughout Egypt's religious calendar. The selection process itself was brutal in its clinical efficiency. Temple priests examined candidates naked, searching for physical imperfections that might offend the gods. A small scar, an uneven tooth, or even asymmetrical breasts could disqualify a girl from temple service, which ironically might have saved her from years of ritualized abuse disguised as religious duty. Research by Dr. Joyce Tildesley at the University of Manchester uncovered temple accounts from Thebes dating to 1550 BC, detailing the daily lives of these sacred prostitutes. They lived in temple complexes, wore distinctive clothing that marked their status, and were forbidden from marrying or bearing children outside their religious duties. When they became pregnant due to their temple service, the children were often dedicated back to the temples, creating generational cycles of religious sexual servitude. But the most disturbing aspect of these divine unions was not their frequency, it was their public nature. During major religious festivals like Opet Men or Syed, thousands of Egyptians gathered to witness the pharaoh or high priests perform sacred marriages with temple women. These ceremonies were not conducted in private chambers, but in full view of the populace, who believed they were witnessing actual divine intercourse that would ensure the Nile's flooding, the harvest's abundance, and the kingdom's prosperity. Contemporary accounts by the Greek historian Herodotus, written around 450 BC, describe his shock at witnessing such ceremonies during his travels in Egypt. He wrote of seeing the most beautiful maidens of noble birth being prepared for unions, with gods appearing in human form, noting that the women displayed visible signs of distress that Egyptian observers seemed to interpret as religious ecstasy. Archaeological evidence from the Temple of Min in Coptos reveals carved scenes depicting these divine unions in explicit detail. The god Min depicted with an erect phallus appears engaging with women whose faces are turned away, an artistic convention some scholars interpret as indicating the women's reluctance or shame. Surrounding these central figures are carved musicians, dancers, and offerings, creating a festive atmosphere around what was essentially ritualized rape. The psychological impact on participants becomes evident when examining fragments of the Edwin Smith surgical papyrus, which contains what may be the world's earliest recorded treatments for trauma. Several remedies describe treatments for women who had served the gods and subsequently suffered symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as sexual trauma, loss of appetite, insomnia, sudden crying, and withdrawal from social contact. Yet the most chilling aspect of all was how completely society accepted these practices. Marriage contracts from the New Kingdom period, 1550 to 1070 BC, routinely included clauses releasing husbands from marital obligations if their wives were called to temple service. Parents negotiated bride prices that explicitly factored in whether their daughters had already served in temples, with used women receiving lower payments despite their supposed divine blessing. The embalming workshop at Bahubra smelled of natron salt and decay as the master embalmer examined the body of a young noblewoman who had died in childbirth in 945 BC. What was about to happen in this mud brick building by the Nile would have horrified the woman's family if they had known. But they didn't know, and they never would because the mummification process held secrets that Egypt's embalmers guarded more zealously than any pharaoh's treasure. Modern CT scans of female mummies at the Cairo Egyptian Museum, conducted by Dr. Zahi Hawass's team in 2005, revealed evidence that has forced Egyptologists to confront one of ancient Egypt's most disturbing secrets: the systematic sexual abuse of female corpses during mummification. The scans showed clear signs of post-mortem sexual trauma in approximately 23% of the female mummies examined, with the damage occurring after death, but before the final wrapping process. The Greek historian Herodotus first hinted at these practices in his histories written around 440 BC. He noted that families of beautiful or high-ranking women waited several days before delivering bodies to embalmers to avoid indignities. He added cryptically that one embalmer had been caught abusing a recently deceased woman and was subsequently killed by his co-workers not for the violation itself, but for being discovered. Papyrus fragments from Deir el-Bahari uncovered during excavations in 1881 contain what appear to be training instructions for embalmers that include disturbing directives on handling female corpses. The texts, written in hieratic script, discuss the need for purification rituals involving the opening of all sacred passages in the deceased woman's body. Modern scholars initially interpreted this as standard evisceration procedures, but the specific anatomical language and ritual context suggests something far more sinister. The mummification process took 70 days, during which corpses remained in embalmers' workshops with minimal oversight from families or religious authorities. Workshop records from Tanis dating to 1000 BC show that embalmers often worked alone during night shifts, when most Egyptians believed the dead were more vulnerable to spiritual attacks. These nighttime working conditions created perfect opportunities for abuses that would never be detected or reported. Physical evidence of these violations comes not only from modern CT scans, but also from ancient sources attempting to address the issue. The Harris Papyrus, now in the British Museum, contains legal documents from 156 BC describing the prosecution of several embalmers for profaning sacred vessels, a euphemistic legal term scholars now believe referred to the sexual abuse of corpses. Punishments were severe. Convicted embalmers faced execution, and their families were stripped of property and exiled from their communities. But the most disturbing aspect of these practices was their ritualistic nature. Evidence suggests some embalmers believed sexual contact with the deceased transferred the woman's life force to the abuser, granting greater virility or a longer life. Amulets found in embalming workshops often depicted sexual acts with mummified figures, and several papyri contain spells meant to be recited during such violations, treating necrophilia as a form of magical practice rather than mere abuse. The mummy of Queen Nefertiti's daughter Menkaten, who died around 1330 BC at age 13, shows clear signs of post-mortem violation when examined with modern forensic techniques. Her wrappings, originally thought to be damaged by tomb robbers, show patterns of deliberate unwrapping and rewrapping in the pelvic area. Resin residues between wrapping layers indicate the body was accessed multiple times during the mummification process, far beyond what any legitimate preservation technique would require. Contemporary accounts from Coptic Christian texts written centuries later describe the horror with which early Christians viewed Egyptian mummification practices. Bishop Theophilus of Alexandria, writing in 385 AD, specifically condemned the desecration of female corpses by those claiming to serve the gods of death. His writing suggests these practices continued well into the Roman period, becoming so notorious that Christian families entirely rejected Egyptian mummification services. The psychological impact on the embalmers themselves becomes evident when examining suicide rates among workers in mummification complexes. Records from Memphis show that embalmers died by suicide at significantly higher rates than other professions, often by drowning in the Nile, a method Egyptians believed prevented the soul from reaching the afterlife. Some scholars suggest this represented self-inflicted punishment for the guilt of men who had violated corpses but could not confess their crimes without facing execution. Perhaps most tragically, some evidence suggests certain women were killed specifically to provide fresh corpses for necrophilic practices. The mummy of a young woman discovered in the Saqqara necropolis shows signs of intentional poisoning with oleander, a plant that kills quickly but leaves the body intact and suitable for mummification. Her wrappings contain papyrus fragments with prayers asking forgiveness from Osiris, suggesting her embalmer knew she had been murdered specifically for his use. Princess Sidamun pressed her forehead against the cold limestone wall of her chamber in the Malkata Palace as she heard her father's footsteps approaching in 1358 BC. At 23, she had already borne at least one child by her father, Pharaoh Amenhotep III, a daughter who now played in the palace gardens, unaware that her grandfather was also her father. That night, as on so many nights before, Sidamun would fulfill her duty as both daughter and wife, perpetuating a cycle of incest that had defined Egyptian royalty for over a millennium. Royal incest in ancient Egypt was not an aberration or historical exaggeration. It was systematic, deliberate, and documented with clinical precision in official royal records. The DNA collection of royal mummies at the Cairo Museum, analyzed by geneticist Dr. Karsten Pusch in 2010, revealed that pharaonic family trees resembled biological disasters more than royal lineages. Tutankhamun himself was the product of a sibling union, and genetic analysis shows he suffered from multiple congenital disorders, including spina bifida, clubfoot, and temporal lobe epilepsy, all likely results of generations of inbreeding. The practice began with Egypt's earliest dynasties around 3100 BC, but reached its most extreme expression during the 18th dynasty, 1550 to 1295 BC. Pharaoh Thutmose married his sister Amos. His son Thutmose II married his half-sister Hatshepsut, and the pattern continued with obsessive regularity. Royal marriage contracts from this period preserved on papyrus in the Metropolitan Museum use specific legal language distinguishing between wives who were sisters of the body, full sisters, and sisters of the house half-sisters, with different inheritance rights assigned to the children of each category. But the extent of royal incest went far beyond sibling marriage. Pharaoh Amenhotep II married 3 of his daughters, and palace records from Amarna show that Akhenaten maintained sexual relations with at least 6 of his daughters simultaneously. A limestone relief from his capital at Amarna shows the pharaoh kissing one daughter while another sits on his lap with hieroglyphic text identifying both girls as his beloved wives and daughters of his body. The psychological toll on royal women becomes evident when examining their short lives and frequent mysterious deaths. Queen Ankhesenamun, daughter and wife of Akhenaten, and later wife of Tutankhamun, survived until age 27, a record by royal standards. Her mummy, discovered in 2010, shows evidence of chronic depression through bone analysis, vitamin D deficiency, from rarely leaving palace chambers, stress fractures from physical abuse, and signs of frequent pregnancies ending in miscarriages or infant deaths. Medical papyri from the Edwin Smith collection describe treatments for conditions that modern doctors recognize as consequences of incest. Remedies for children born twisted include instructions for splints exercises and herbal treatments, suggesting royal physicians regularly treated birth defects. A particularly disturbing text describes a surgical procedure for infants born with sealed passages, likely referring to genital malformations common in heavily inbred populations. The most chilling evidence comes from the royal mummy cache discovered in 1881 at Deir el-Bahari. Of the 11 royal mummies found there, DNA analysis revealed that 9 were products of incestuous unions, and 7 showed evidence of significant genetic disorders. 2 infant mummies found in Tutankhamun's tomb were his daughters born of his marriage to his half-sister Ankhesenamun, and both suffered from neural tube defects that made survival impossible. Palace intrigue often revolved around which daughters would be selected for royal marriages. The Amarna letters' diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and neighboring kingdoms contains several messages from foreign rulers expressing horror at Egyptian marriage customs. The king of Mitanni wrote to Amenhotep III in 1350 BC, "Your daughters who are wives are numerous, yet you have sent none of your daughters to me in marriage. Why is this your daughters are your wives? Your wives are your daughters. This confuses my scribes when they write marriage agreements." Contemporary records reveal that Egyptian royal women often attempted to escape their fate by various means. Several papyri describe daughters fleeing to neighboring kingdoms, only to be forcibly returned by Egyptian armies. A text from 1345 BC describes Princess Bekhetaten's attempt to seek asylum, with the Hittites writing to their king, "My father wishes to make me his wife, as he did my sisters, but I would rather die in foreign lands than submit to such a violation of nature's law." The practice created its own perverse, courtly culture, where normal family relationships became impossible. Royal children grew up unsure whether their mothers were actually sisters or aunts, whether their brothers were actually fathers or uncles. Palace records from the time of Ramses II describe a complex system of titles and etiquette designed to navigate these confusing relationships with specific protocols for addressing relatives who held multiple familial roles simultaneously. The religious justification for incest came from identification with the gods Isis and Osiris, who were married siblings. Temple reliefs show royal couples making offerings, while hieroglyphic texts emphasize their sibling relationship as a divine blessing. Yet private papyri from noble families reveal widespread revulsion toward royal practices. A noble wrote to his son around 1330 BC, "The royal house breeds like animals in their dens, sister with brother, father with daughter. For this the gods curse their children with twisted limbs and early death." The genetic consequences compounded with each generation. By the end of the 18th dynasty, royal infants died at birth at rates exceeding 60%, and surviving children often suffered intellectual disabilities, physical deformities, and short lives. Tutankhamun's mummy reveals a young man who could barely walk without assistance, suffered chronic pain, and died at 19 from complications that genetic analysis suggests were directly tied to his inbred heritage. Oil lamps flickered in the temple of Hathor at Dendera, as 12-year-old Nefertari lay on the stone altar, her small hands clutching the carved edges until her knuckles turned white in 1290 BC. She was about to become the latest victim of one of ancient Egypt's most brutal religious practices, the ritualized deflowering performed by priests to open the sacred gate for the gods. The ceremony would be witnessed by dozens of temple officials, recorded by scribes, and celebrated by a community that viewed her violation as a divine blessing. Archaeological evidence from the Temple of Mut at Karnak reveals that such ceremonies were far from rare occurrences. Stone tablets cataloging temple activities from 1400 to 1200 BC list over 300 individual deflowering rituals, complete with the names of the girls involved, their ages, and the specific priests who performed the ceremonies. The youngest girl recorded was 9 years old. The oldest was 16. Most were between 12 and 14, barely past puberty, in a society where childhood ended early and brutally. The process began with elaborate purification rituals lasting 3 days. Girls selected for deflowering were bathed in sacred pools, anointed with oils mixed with frankincense and myrrh, and fed special foods believed to enhance their spiritual receptivity. During this preparation period, they were forbidden from speaking to anyone except designated temple priestesses, who instructed them on their divine duties and warned that resistance or displays of fear would anger the gods. Papyrus fragments from the Ramesseum describe the theological justification for these practices. Egyptian priests believed female virginity held special spiritual power that could only be properly harvested through ritual deflowering performed by men who had undergone specific purification rites. The act itself was considered a form of sacrifice, with the girl's blood and pain offered to deities in exchange for divine favors for the entire community. The ceremonies followed rigid protocols documented in temple teaching texts discovered at Edfu. The girl would be brought before gathered witnesses dressed in a transparent linen robe and gold jewelry marking her status as a sacred offering. Incense would be burned while temple musicians played specific hymns meant to invoke the presence of fertility gods. A high priest representing the deity would then deflower the girl using implements preserved as sacred relics, often knives, stone phalluses, or carved wooden objects believed to channel divine power. Dr. Joanne Fletcher's analysis of human remains found in temple complexes at Abydos revealed physical evidence of these practices. Skeletal remains of young women show signs of pelvic trauma consistent with violent sexual assault, often accompanied by evidence of infection and sometimes death from internal injuries. Carbon dating places these remains across Egypt's imperial period, suggesting the practices continued for over 500 years. The psychological impact of these ceremonies was systematically ignored or reinterpreted through religious doctrine. Girls who showed signs of trauma, mutism, withdrawal, or self-harm were deemed touched by the divine and often permanently dedicated to temple service. Medical papyri contain treatments for divine madness in young women, including herbal remedies for violent outbursts, insomnia, and refusal to eat symptoms. Modern psychology recognizes as indicators of severe sexual trauma. Some temples developed elaborate hierarchies around deflowering ceremonies with different priests specializing in different aspects of the ritual. The Chester Beatty 5-6 papyrus contains administrative records showing that certain priests held the specific title of opener of the sacred gate, a position that came with special privileges, including increased food rations, better housing, and rights to select which girls they would deflower. These positions were highly coveted and often passed from father to son, creating dynasties of ritualized abusers. Regional variations in these practices were documented by traveling scribes who recorded cultural differences between temple complexes. In Lower Egypt, deflowering ceremonies were typically performed during the flood season when the Nile overflowed, symbolically linking the girl's blood with the river's life-giving waters. In Upper Egypt, ceremonies aligned with harvest festivals, with the girl's violation seen as a guarantee of fertility for both crops and livestock. The most disturbing records come from the Temple of Min at Coptos, where annual festivals included mass deflowering ceremonies involving dozens of girls simultaneously. The Greek visitor Strabo, writing in 25 BC, described witnessing such a festival and noted his shock at seeing maidens no older than children being violated by priests while crowds cheered and threw flowers. His account mentions that several girls died during the ceremonies from blood loss or shock, but their deaths were celebrated as signs of divine acceptance. Economic records reveal that families were often compensated for providing daughters for these ceremonies, but payments were structured to prevent refusal. Thebes' temple ledgers show that families received grain, livestock, or land grants, but only after their daughters had completed their sacred service. Families attempting to withdraw their daughters before the ceremonies faced severe penalties, including loss of property, exile, or forced labor obligations. Some surviving texts hint at resistance networks among women attempting to protect young girls from being selected for these ceremonies. Papyrus fragments from private archives describe coded language used to warn families when temple scouts were searching for new candidates. A text from 1250 BC says, "When the lotus seekers come to your door, remember the river runs deep but also flees." Scholars believe this was a reference to escape routes used by families fleeing to avoid their daughters being selected for deflowering ceremonies. Twilight settled over the Temple of Bastet at Bubastis as hundreds of oil lamps were lit across the complex, their flickering lights casting dancing shadows on walls covered in hieroglyphs depicting cats, dancers, and ritual scenes. In 570 BC, Ptolemaic Egypt prepared for one of its most notorious religious festivals, a 3-day celebration where ordinary women were transformed into sacred prostitutes, offering their bodies to strangers in honor of the cat goddess. What unfolded during these festivals would shock even seasoned ancient historians, yet it represented only one facet of a religious prostitution system that had operated in Egypt for over 2,000 years. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing around 450 BC, described his first-hand account of such festivals. Once a year, the women of this region gather at the Temple of Bastet and for 3 days offer themselves to any man who brings the proper payment to the goddess. No woman may refuse any man during this time, be he Egyptian, Greek, Nubian, or Persian. The money paid goes to the temple, but the act itself is considered the holiest duty a woman can perform. Archaeological excavations at Bubastis, conducted by Edouard Naville between 1887 and 1889, uncovered physical evidence of these prostitution festivals beneath the temple floors. Archaeologists found thousands of small ceramic tokens bearing the image of Bastet on one side and explicit sexual images on the other. These tokens, carbon dated to various periods between 800 and 200 BC, served as payment receipts for sexual services during religious festivals. The sheer number of tokens, over 12,000 recovered from a single excavation site, suggests these festivals involve thousands of women providing sexual services to thousands of men in relatively short periods. But sacred prostitution in Egypt extended far beyond annual festivals. Temple records from Philae, discovered during the Aswan High Dam rescue operations in the 1960s, document a permanent class of sacred prostitutes called wives of Amun, who served male temple visitors year-round. These women lived in special quarters within temple complexes, wore distinctive clothing that advertised their availability, and followed strict religious protocols governing their sexual services. The daily lives of these sacred prostitutes are documented in remarkable detail through papyrus archives discovered at Teb, Tunis in 1899. Personal letters between prostitutes reveal the psychological toll of their situation. One woman wrote to her sister around 200 BC, "I have served 37 men this month, and still the goddess demands more. My body aches, but worse is my heart, which hardens each day like stone under the sun. I pray to Bastet to release me from this service, but she remains silent." Economic records show that sacred prostitution generated enormous revenue for Egyptian temples. Ledgers from the Temple of Sobek at Crocodilopolis detail payments for sexual services alongside offerings of grain, livestock, and precious metals. During peak festival periods, prostitution revenue outstripped all other temple income combined. This economic dependence created powerful incentives to recruit new prostitutes and expand sexual services, regardless of the human cost. The recruitment of sacred prostitutes followed patterns that modern observers would recognize as human trafficking. Poor families were approached by temple representatives who offered to take their daughters as servants of the goddess, promising good food, shelter, and spiritual rewards. Once girls entered temple complexes, they rarely left. Legal documents from Oxyrhynchus describe several cases where families attempted to reclaim daughters recruited for temple service, only to be told the girls had made sacred vows that could not be broken without divine punishment. Medical papyri from the Kahun archive contain extensive information on treating diseases and injuries common among sacred prostitutes. Remedies for temple sickness, likely sexually transmitted infections, appear repeatedly alongside treatments for pregnancy prevention, abortion-inducing herbs, and healing ointments for genital injuries. A particularly disturbing text describes surgical procedures to repair severe internal damage caused by violent clients, suggesting abuse was both common and systematic. The age of girls entering sacred prostitution dropped significantly during times of economic hardship, famine, or military conflict. Temple records show spikes in divine dedications of girls as young as 10 or 11. The Wilbur Papyrus, dating to 141 BC, contains a census of sacred prostitutes across multiple temples, listing dozens of girls under 14, several described as not yet having reached maturity, but already serving male clients. Regional variations in sacred prostitution practices were documented by Greek and Roman visitors traveling through Egypt. In Memphis, prostitutes served clients in underground chambers beneath the main temple complex, with elaborate ventilation and soundproofing systems, suggesting the activities were deliberately hidden from public view. In Elephantine, prostitution took place in gardens surrounding the temple, with clients and prostitutes engaging in sexual acts while other visitors prayed and made offerings nearby. The psychological control exerted over sacred prostitutes was reinforced through religious indoctrination, beginning in childhood. Girls were taught that sexual service to strangers was the highest form of worship, that their bodies were vessels for divine energy, and that resistance or unhappiness indicated spiritual failure. Confession texts found at various temple sites show prostitutes writing prayers, begging forgiveness for feelings of revulsion, fear, or desire to escape their duties. Some prostitutes attempted to document their experiences in ways that have survived the centuries. Graffiti carved into temple walls at Edfu include messages from women serving as sacred prostitutes, many expressing despair or resignation. An inscription dated to 156 BC says, "Isis knows the pain in my heart, but I cannot speak it aloud." May other daughters be spared this blessing. Another simply states, I have forgotten my name, but the goddess remembers my body. The practice of sacred prostitution created complex legal and social issues that Egyptian courts struggled to address. Judicial records from Thebes describe cases where men contracted sexually transmitted diseases from sacred prostitutes and demanded compensation from temples. Other legal documents detail disputes over children born from sacred prostitution encounters, with questions about paternity inheritance rights and whether such children belong to their mothers or the temples where they were conceived. In 1279 BC, the embalming workshop beside the Valley of the Kings hummed with activity as User-Hatmos prepared the mummy of a noblewoman named Merit Ptah for her eternal journey. But this preparation involved far more than organ removal and flesh preservation. According to religious texts carved deep within royal tombs, Merit Ptah would need her sexual organs intact and functional for the afterlife, where she was expected to provide sexual services to male spirits gods and potentially the pharaoh himself throughout eternity. The mummification process therefore included specific procedures to ensure female corpses remained sexually viable for their posthumous duties. The pyramid texts dating to 2400 BC and representing some of Egypt's oldest religious writings contain explicit descriptions of sexual activities expected in the afterlife. Dead pharaohs were promised beautiful women to serve them in every way, while female spirits were described as existing primarily to provide sexual pleasure to male souls. The text known as Pyramid Text 690 states, "The king shall possess the wives of the gods, and they shall satisfy his desires, as they satisfied the desires of their divine husbands when living." Archaeological evidence from tombs in the Valley of the Queens reveals that noble and royal women were buried with objects specifically designed for sexual use in the afterlife. Excavations by Dr. Joanne Fletcher at QV55, believed to be the tomb of one of Ramses II's daughters, uncovered a collection of phallic objects made of wood, ivory, and stone. These objects were wrapped in linen and placed between the mummy's legs, positioned to remain accessible to the deceased woman's spirit. Similar objects have been found in dozens of female tombs from the New Kingdom period. The mummification process for women included procedures not performed on male corpses designed to preserve sexual functionality for the afterlife. Papyrus documents from Thebes workshops describe the insertion of resin-soaked linen into the vaginal canals of female corpses, apparently to prevent tissue collapse during preservation. However, the positioning and materials used suggest these insertions were intended to maintain the shape and accessibility of sexual organs rather than merely preserve them. Tomb paintings in the burial chambers of high-ranking officials depict scenes of the deceased engaging in sexual acts with female servants who died with them. In the tomb of Vizier Remteti, 10-100 dated to 1450 BC wall paintings show the deceased official copulating with women identified as his eternal maids, while other figures prepare food and entertainment. These images were not decorative or symbolic. They were instructional manuals for activities expected to continue in the afterlife. The practice of sacrificing female servants to accompany male tomb owners in death was widely documented during Egypt's early dynastic period, but continued in modified forms throughout pharaonic history. Skeletal remains from subsidiary tombs beside main burial sites show evidence of ritual strangulation poisoning or live burial of young women. The tomb of Pharaoh Jer at Abydos, dating to 3000 BC, contained the remains of 338 sacrificed servants, with forensic analysis showing that 127 were young women with no signs of natural death. Religious texts found in private tombs describe the eternal sexual duties expected of women in the afterlife. The Book of the Dead, specifically chapter 125, includes a section known as the Negative Confession, where souls must deny various sins before the gods. For women, this confession includes pledges to serve the desires of righteous men and to open myself to those who have earned divine favor. These texts make clear that female souls were expected to provide sexual services not as a reward for their own virtue, but as punishment for their inherently sinful nature. Forensic examination of female mummies has revealed evidence of post-mortem sexual positioning designed to facilitate necrophilic activities. The mummy of Queen Henutawi, wife of High Priest Pinagem, shows signs that her legs were repositioned and held open during the wrapping process. Similar positioning appears in dozens of female mummies from the 21st dynasty, suggesting systematic preparation of female corpses for sexual access. The tomb of Pharaoh Seti contains one of the most disturbing examples of afterlife sexual expectations. Hidden chambers behind the main burial hall, discovered only in 1960, contain explicit wall paintings showing the deceased pharaoh engaging in sexual acts with female deities, goddesses, and mortal women. Accompanying hieroglyphic texts describe the women as eternal concubines who will satisfy the king's desires throughout eternity without rest or complaint. Funerary goods specifically designed for sexual activities in the afterlife appear regularly in royal and noble tombs. The tomb of Yuya and Chuyu, parents of Queen Ti, contained a collection of objects initially cataloged by archaeologists as religious implements, but revealed by modern examination to be sophisticated sex toys. These objects, carved from ebony and ivory with remarkable anatomical precision, were wrapped in the finest linen and placed in cedar boxes inscribed with prayers for their effectiveness in the afterlife. Medical papyri contains spells and procedures to ensure mummified women remain sexually attractive to male spirits. The Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus includes instructions for preventing facial disfigurement during mummification specifically for female corpses, noting that ugliness repels the desires of gods and men even in death. These procedures were more expensive and time-consuming than standard mummification, creating a lucrative specialization for embalmers, catering to wealthy families who wanted to ensure their daughters remained desirable in the afterlife. Contemporary accounts from Greek and Roman visitors describe their horror at Egyptian funerary practices involving women. Diodorus Siculus, writing in 50 BC, noted his shock at learning that Egyptian women were prepared for death as if being readied for marriage with great attention paid to their sexual organs and their ability to please men even beyond the grave. He described witnessing funerary preparations where deceased women were positioned and dressed as if they were courtesans awaiting clients. The sacred lakes beside temples reflected torchlight during the most abject festivals where thousands gathered to witness acts that would have been criminal in daylight, but became sacred under the cover of religious ceremony. Aristocratic women, temple prostitutes, and captured foreign slaves mingled in scenes of ritualized sexual violence that participants believed would ensure divine favor. Children born from these encounters were raised as temple property, continuing cycles of abuse that lasted centuries. Yet the most disturbing aspect was how completely Egyptian society normalized these practices. Marriage contracts routinely included clauses releasing husbands from obligations if their wives were called to sexually serve a god. Parents calculated bride prices based on their daughters' prior temple service. Medical texts treated the trauma of ritual rape as divine madness, requiring gratitude rather than healing. When Rome finally conquered Egypt in 30 BC, one of Octavian's first acts was to ban temple prostitution and ritual deflowering ceremonies. Christian missionaries arriving centuries later found abandoned temples, their walls still bearing explicit carvings that local Egyptians were too ashamed to explain to their children. Walk back through those tomb corridors now past hieroglyphs, whose meanings we are only beginning to understand. Each symbol tells a story of a civilization that saw beauty in brutality, found divinity in degradation, and convinced itself that the suffering of the innocent was the price of divine favor. The intimate practices of ancient Egypt reveal humanity's capacity to sanctify the unspeakable, a reminder that throughout history, the most monstrous acts have often worn the mask of the sacred. Return to the daylight, but remember what lurks in those shadows. Remember the voices still echoing through limestone corridors, casting warnings across millennia. Remember that behind every glorious civilization lie secrets written in blood and tears preserved forever in stone.